Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, March 8th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about President Biden's State of the Union speech last night. In President Biden's State of the Union speech, he received overwhelming praise from members of the left wing and many members of the center and even some from the right for a very strong and powerful State of the Union. More than 6 in 10 State of the Union viewers had a positive reaction to President Biden's speech, according to a CNN instant poll. Now, we are going to be unpacking the poll here, the coverage of many different platforms like the Washington Post and the Hill and the Guardian and the Associated Press and so on and so forth, and just discussing how this State of the Union speech genuinely puts a fire for Democrats, a fire in their hearts for Democrats in 2024, and shows us the type of Biden that can win this election. Now, I will first start off by saying that last night's State of the Union speech was genuinely a very strong and powerful one. Objectively, it was one of President Biden's best public performances in the past couple of years, and looking at the stakes from last evening, he could not have done better. I will say that there was heavy expectation that President Biden was not going to perform well last evening. Republicans went so far as to expect that he may not even be able to do a State of the Union speech, and it fed into this narrative that the media and the right wing have been leaning into, that President Biden is somehow unfit to serve in the next 4 years should he decide or should he be reelected by the American public. And whether you agree with that or not, at the end of the day, that is the notion that has done well across the country, with the majority of Americans, taking a look at this and saying, my opinion of Biden absolutely does change. And the language that is used around it in describing his State of the Union speech versus the Republican response to the State of the Union could not be more clear. Quite literally, it is night and day. But coming into this again, you had the majority of Americans saying that President Biden was just too old for another term. We'll unpack this as we look further in the instant poll that was done by CNN, but it genuinely shows that there is movement when President Biden performs well in national spotlights. Now, this is the way that President Biden largely has been approaching the State of the Union speeches, his campaign speeches. We saw the one he held in Pennsylvania. That was his first public showing for the 2024 election, where he did tremendously well compared to the expectations that were set up. What he's doing here is combating a narrative that he is somehow, unable to serve out the 4 years, but leaning into the idea that he is in fact old, but his ideas are not. As we go through here, we're going to be discussing the electability points of this too, and how performances like last night's State of the Union does help him, move forward in this election and does help him gain voters, as we will see looking through it now. Now, the top line here is that roughly 65% of viewers for the State of the Union had a positive reaction to his speech. But it gets actually a lot better for President Biden and Democrats when you take a look at some of the more individual numbers. Now, before we had this State of the Union speech, CNN did a field of polls for a bunch of people who were going to watch the State of the Union. What they do here is they get a focus group and get a group of people for their poll and ask them questions about President Biden. Do you think he's fit to serve? Do you believe that his policies will move the United States in the right direction? Do you believe in his economic policies? And so a lot of these things that they're asking about are sort of just precursor questions when they have a general idea of what the president will talk about at the State of the Union. And they'll see. Now, when they do watch the State of the Union, what the difference in opinion is from then versus now. And it's not a perfect science, but it absolutely is an indicator of how viewers of the State of the Union, the most highly watched State of the Union since 2021 for President Biden, you're talking, nearly 30 million Americans tuning in to the State of the Union, you find here that there are movements in terms of how people are viewing here, or 30 million, viewers. I guess that could be more than 30 million Americans. But it's very, very interesting. And so when we're taking a look here, Americans who view President Biden and his policies, roughly 62% believe that it will move the United States in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. Prior to the speech being done, just 45% of those same people believe that President Biden's policies would move the United States in the right direction. Just over 6 in 10 Americans who tuned in expressed at least some confidence in Biden's ability to protect American democracy. And 59% say at least some, the ability to perform some of the duties of the presidency and have confidence in his ability to carry out this term to full. So looking at that, that's a high enough number based on those who are watching the State of the Union speech who believe that he has the ability to carry out his duties as president. But that wasn't always the case. When we're taking a look at a lot of these numbers, you will find that prior to this confidence did not always exist. Looking at the numbers here, 36% of those who watched the speech said they have a lot of confidence in Biden to protect American democracy, with 27% expressing some confidence and 37% saying that they have no real confidence in him. And that's something that you have to take into account and understand as President Biden, as his campaign team. But overall, these numbers don't look like he's in the negatives, right? The majority of people are aligning with President Biden on this topic. Now, following the speech, the numbers got better. 31% of those who watched say that they have a lot of confidence in Biden's ability to carry out his duties as president, and 28% have some confidence, with 41% saying that they have no real confidence. Again, taking a look at the difference here, based on where it was before, in the survey conducted days before the speech, it was 25% saying that they have a lot of confidence versus 31%, and 27% having some confidence versus 28%. Overall, the number did increase in a significant way too, with 48% days before the speech saying that they have no confidence at all, a reduction of 48 to 41. And the improvement came largely amongst political independents. Just 51% believe that Biden was confident to carry out his full term, rising to 68% amongst the same group of independents after the speech. It's these numbers and these improvements, whether it comes down to his ability to protect American democracy, whether it comes down to his ability to carry out his duties as president of the United States, some of the biggest issues for the American public, the 2020 election security, whether or not President Biden would prevent an overturning of the election, they prevent voting rights being, completely gotten rid of in some of these states. I mean, these are things that voters genuinely do care about, in addition to the traditional healthcare, economic, foreign relations, things along those ends. But you do find that he does win over voters on democracy and now seemingly on capacity to serve out the full term. Because although President Biden is old, fundamentally, that's true, and he acknowledges that, and he did so in this speech. I mean, he leaned into it heavily and said, yes, I am old, but that actually is a strength. He took a page out of Reagan's, blueprint here, playbook here, and said, I'm old, but it means that I know how to get through this. It means I have seen America at its best, America at its worst, America in all different visions and all different lights. And so he really, really, really leaned into that last evening, and I think he did a good job at doing it. And clearly, those who listened to the State of the Union agreed. And so now to the point of the 2024 election, we take a look at this and see that voters seem to have liked and positively responded to the Biden they saw last evening. The type of candidate that they want to see on the general election campaign trail, because he is what they think can lead this country. And I think with all of these narratives around President Biden, his numbers did start to take a hit. He started losing support because of the conflict in the Middle East amongst young voters. He started to lose support amongst older voters because of his age and what they perceived as an inability to serve out the full capacity of President of the United States. And last night's State of the Union, to not inflate it to say that it has somehow changed the election, but it has shown us that it is absolutely possible that this narrative around President Biden can be vanquished, at least in a very noticeable way. And it reminds me a lot, in fact, of the 2020 election, when President Biden started out with a very negative view of him amongst the American populace. While we don't have the general election data, favorability rate, or not the general election data, while we don't have the job approval data of President Biden, we do have favorability data from the past. I don't have it here on the screen, unfortunately, because this is all about President Biden's job approval. But when President Biden was running for office in March, April, May, June, July, up until the DNC, President Biden was largely disapproved of by the American public. And so in order to, combat the double-digit negatives in terms of approval, the Biden campaign laid out the groundwork and really just pushed out a campaign focused on President Biden's character. They focused on Biden being a family man, on Biden being someone that was genuine, honest, kind, and in doing so, he was able to take what was a negative and ended up being approved of shortly after. It was a long campaign, largely ushered in after and during the DNC. But by the time we had finished August, his approval rating went from somewhere in the -8, -9 to +8 and +9. And in just around a month, you found that President Biden's perception by American voters was much more positive then than it was prior to. And while that did come alongside some key policy and campaign decisions that made President Trump look worse in comparison, it still was a victory for President Biden because it allowed him the opportunity to move forward and win the election as a popular outside candidate, as someone who was not the incumbent and didn't have a job approval rating, but instead had a favorability rating. And it was really and honestly very good for President Biden. And so in seeing that, it is also evident to me that the Biden campaign and the strategy here, I think, is to change the narrative on this issue. I don't think they're ever going to win on the side of Biden being young enough for another term. He is old and would serve out this term starting at 81 years old. He is the oldest president we have ever had in United States history. He's older than Bill Clinton, who served out his presidency between 1992 and the year 2000. That's where we are. And so I think instead of deflecting and hiding from that, what Biden did correctly, and I think that we've rarely seen this issue tackled correctly, and I think he did it in a way that could, make himself electable and the way he could brand himself to the public, is that yes, he is old, and with that comes experience, and that his ideas, and, even though he might be, his ideas are not old. His ideas are about visions for the future and for the benefit of the American public. And so with all of these things, I think sort of coming back and forth. He's too old, well, his ideas aren't, yada, yada, yada. It helps put up a way to combat this narrative instead of just admitting, one, that he's too old and having no rebuttal to that, or two, trying to deflect from it, because the public is very clear on this too, that they believe he is too old. There doesn't seem to be any way you could combat that besides the fact that you would say, sure, yes, he is old. But so is Trump, and he's in a lot better of a place mentally. I think that's what you started to see with the rapid response from the Biden HQ here, is that they're taking Trump's speeches and the places where he messes up and putting that very, very public, making it known that President Trump does not have it all together. And so with all of these things being, funneled into one central campaign theme and one central campaign strategy, I do think it's going to start to pay off. Because the more that the American public has confidence in President Biden, just as the viewers of the State of the Union speech were, following this speech, if he brings us to the campaign trail, I genuinely think that could change the trajectory of this election. Not overnight, but in due time. And so when I see that, it is more clear than ever that Biden absolutely has a pathway forward to win this election. That there is a strategy, and there is one that the American public does in fact positively respond to. The State of the Union is never meant to be a political speech, but President Biden used it to that effect. He went after President Trump, he went after Republicans, and largely in a way that does not seem like it will turn away independents, that it will turn away Haley type of supporters, right? He seems to be doing this in a way that pushes away the Trump base while capturing in the same group of people that elected him in the first place back in 2020. And so looking at this too, I see the Biden of 2020 again in last night's Biden 2024 speech. I'm not going to act here and treat this as if the media, the right wing, and that even those opposed to President Biden on the left, haven't done a good job at painting this narrative. And whether you agree with it or not, the narrative absolutely exists that President Biden should not serve out another term. But again, last night's speech, I think, puts confidence in a lot more people than it would have had he messed up. I think it put a lot more confidence in people than we're even expected to have confidence from this result. I think last night's State of the Union probably went as best as it could have for President Biden in this upcoming election. And good news to him, this is the last one before we reach the election season. And so in just around a few days, we will be at our roughly 4-year anniversary from President Biden practically clinching the Democratic nomination. It's going to be so fascinating to see what happens from here as we move into the genuine regular election of Trump versus Biden. With Nikki Haley's departure from the race and Dean Phillips' departure from the race, there really isn't anybody major on either side of the aisle, which means we're moving full force into the general election season, and last night's State of the Union address was very strong for President Biden and a very good starting place moving into the general. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below, subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.